Hello and welcome to another episode of Mordred's Community Multiplayer Political Chat. Joined again this week by Archmill. Archmill, how's it going?
Hello there. I'm doing fine, thanks.
Interesting session. Before we get into the nitty gritty, we'll take a look at the great powers. A little bit of movement here on the list. Phoenix Empire, Eberthil, Boya Scarvo, Erdend, Rubenair, uh, whatever the Greeks are,
Take a K
Vern,
on. Yeah.
and Cyranovar. Any
Yeah.
surprises here on this list for you?
I'm actually surprised, though I shouldn't be, that Vern got up here in this amount of force, being like on a similar footing as Degakaon. But I shouldn't be surprised considering their colonial holdings. Um, Other than that, no real surprises. Perhaps also Rubenair also getting out on top there. Well, on fifth, whereas they weren't on the list last session.
Yeah, I surprised myself a little bit there. Had to adjust my player allies partway through the session. Did manage to move up that list relatively quickly. There is a lot of high development land around
Mm-hmm.
Rubenair from Laurent and the various nations, so it's been a pretty ascendant climb for me between sessions 2 and
Yeah,
3.
you can say that.
Session 1 to 2 was relatively slow, but since then it's accelerated.
Mm-hmm.
So let's dive into the new world here. We got a new tag formed by the Northern Rune Elves, or the Fey Rune Elves. We've got a
Mm-hmm.
new tag by the Battle Elves. The Greeks are still working towards their formable, and then we've
But
got
close to reforming.
yep, and we've got the Jaharian Exemplars have already reformed. We have Swampland, Slurfins playing a colonial nation under Eberthil, and then obviously Neckliffe and Vern. Any surprises jump out at you here?
um, no big surprises except for the fact how much Neckliffe has grown in colonial Amalia. Um, it's been a real impressive comeback. We usually see if there is a resin canned, they tend to grow quite explosively. Um, Other than that, I'm impressed with how much presence the colonial powers in Vern and Emberfield have, but I'm unsure if that's gonna last.
Yeah, and just looking at alliances in the web in the New World, we do have Neckliffe allied with the Greeks, the Fey
Hmm.
Runeborn, as well as the Sun Elves. So that's a pretty powerful coalition that may be aligning itself against Vern and Eberthil. I'm expecting to see
Yes.
some fireworks there. Maybe not next session, but in the next couple of sessions, as the colonial land gets gobbled up and the borders become a little more frictionful.
I definitely think we're gonna see a unified South Elantir of the Ruinborn and Neckliffe uh, versus the Colonials, and then it's gonna be difficult for those tags as they become, or most of them already are great powers, how to juggle their relations. Um, but I do see them all staying friendly.
Yeah, and then as we shift to the west, we've got our good friends Von Rahar. Pretty strong
Hmm.
tag. Interesting to note, spoke with Holy Victor a little bit. They did have to declare bankruptcy.
Oh,
Apparently, the AI wars in this area, if you take a look, they've got a truce with a number of the large nations in the area. So, looks like they went to war
yes.
with uh, the Overlord or the Raj. So,
Ah,
it looked like that took a lot out of them, but they did not lose any cores. So, looks like they're doing pretty well and look positioned to come out of this bankruptcy stronger than ever.
it's good to see them allied to Ovdal Kanzad as well. I think they're gonna be a strong pairing between the two of them.
Yeah, and we'll touch on Oddville Konzad now,
Hmm.
I guess. 4 holds now, starting to expand. Is it too little, too late for a remnant dwarf at this stage of the game, or are we going to see them snowball here moving forward?
Um, it very well might be. It kind of depends, I think, on how much uh the Phoenix Empire is gonna be tied up in wars on the western side of their territory. Um, because as long as Verkogulen and Greedy Grin, two vassals of the Phoenix Empire, don't expand too much, um, Kansas can just freely expand. They can go east considerably. The command is not looking good, so there's still a lot of dev for them to gain in the short term, but it's going to be tight for them to stay or become relevant in the grand scheme of things.
Yeah, I hope Volkanzad and Von Rach are working together, kind of snowballs both of their growth, and we see a strong power coming out of this area. Because shifting north, we've got Magharama, strong session out of them, and then we
Hmm.
have the Lake Federation, which
Yes,
not on the Great Power list, but as you look through their
on the
mission
cusp.
tree, I believe they are 1 or 2 years away from being able to click the button.
Yeah.
So, and that's going to shoot them to number one on the Great Power list overnight. Um,
Hmm.
what do you see next coming out of the Forbidden Plains and the Lake Federation?
It's difficult to assess how the balance of power is going to be when the Lake Fed unites. Uh, Mostly also because I'm not sure what their diplomatic game is going to be, and Magarma has some options, even though they have two player vassals right now, so their diplomacy is kind of limited. They do have three players, and they could strike a deal with either the Phoenix Empire or the Dwarves in the Mountains uh, to form a pretty solid block against the Lake Fed. And I do think we're going to see those two come to a head.
And then you mentioned the dwarves in the mountains. We have or Lazam Azdir, or the
Hmm.
Ram Dwarfs, won a pivotal war against Rail
Yes.
Skulker. It was a little bit tricky to follow on the stream, but from speaking with Darkfighter afterwards, it seems like it was relatively back and forth, pretty close war, pretty
Yep.
painful war for both parties, and um, it just went the dwarves' way at the end, and Rail Skulker was pretty much torched at that point. Uh, it seems like the Ramdors are still digging themselves out of a considerable amount of debt, but being heavily subsidized by the Phoenix Empire. Um, do you think they should have gone bankrupt here and gotten it out of the way?
Maybe. Maybe that would have been beneficial. But if they can, just as the Phoenix Empire is giving them subsidies, maybe other parties that might want to seek um, their alliance or their favor, might be willing to send money their way, and perhaps they can recover that way. And seeing the trade node that they are in, they could really get money quickly. And they're also going to need a lot of monarch points to do that, to core all that, and to rebuild those holds. So perhaps this is the better way, just because from a mana perspective.
And then shifting to the south, we've got Thieving Arrow, our other Serpent Spine inhabitants. Um, a decent session from them. They were played by AI previously, but we see
Hmm.
they've started to expand out into I believe it's the Diamond Dwarves. Yep.
Yes.
So starting to take over their section of the Serpent Spine. You see they've got a condottieri to the Phoenix Empire army right now that's moving in to assist um, the Wood Elves
The
in
Wood
their
Elves.
efforts. Similar question to Oval Khanzad. Do they have enough time to snowball here, or is it going to be difficult for them to make an impact as we transition into the mid game?
I think for Thieving Arrow, it's going to be a little bit more difficult. It kind of depends on their diplomatic situation. Both Orla Zamazir and Thieving Arrows seemingly have aligned with the Phoenix Empire. But one thing to note is that, yes, Thieving Arrow can get more land in the western bit from Ordston, but on the eastern bit of their land, they're cut off by the Wood Elves through their vassal in Began's expedition. So either they need to make a Diplo arrangement, which maybe could well be why they're giving the Connocherry right now, um, or they're gonna have to find a way to break out of that, yeah, that corner they've gotten themselves into.
And then we'll rotate over to our Viking friends in Bjarnrik. Relatively good session for them. I'm actually surprised that they are not on the Great Power list. They are just
Hmm.
off of it. just outside, but um, as you look at their diplomatic map mode, still allied with the Gnomish hierarchy despite the eventual conflict in their mission trees.
Yeah.
Two large vassals in Westmore and Everwharf starting to take chunks out of Frozen Maw. Um, are we reaching a point where Bjarnrik's being ignored by most of their neighbors so that they've got an opportunity to expand quite aggressively here?
I mean, 100%. I would already say that uh, Arboran, perhaps also Gnomish hierarchy, maybe even small country, have been neglecting expanding into Gawet a little bit, um, and Bjarnrik has been taking full advantage of that. So it's gonna be likely that they will have to do something against Bjarnrik before they find themselves getting attacked by Bjarnrik in a moment that's not opportune to them.
And then pivoting a little further south, Gnomish hierarchy in Rubenair in small country, relatively quiet sessions for them, a decent amount of growth. We know about the small country's economic activities as well as their condottieri, but the gnomes have started a little bit of colonization in the New World, and Rubenair continues to expand into
Produce a
Laurent.
lot of wine.
Yeah, anything to note between these three on the western edge of the empire?
Um, it's just a little bit of cleanup of Duran and Laurent, I think. But other than that, I don't see these borders shift considerably. I do know that the small country, from an RP perspective, has a thing against Laurent. Uh, so I wonder if Rubenair is going to form Laurent, that they can smooth that over. I presume they could, but that could be a spark of tension down the road.
And then shifting into the Empire itself before we dive into the Eskin Wars, Abencost, another relatively quiet session. The dev in their uh,
Mm, yeah.
capital is reaching outrageous levels at 90% now. Conwell seems like they spent most of the session involved in some of the Eskin activities along with
Hmm.
Gaberd. So still a ton of AI surrounding Conwell, Gaberd, Arboran, and Vern. Do you expect that to change over the next session?
I wouldn't be surprised if we are going to see a player war in that area next session. Um, uh, Arban has to lose a diplomatic relation because of their new vassal, which is going to be a player in Ancardia. They may as well drop Gibert and leave them to Conwell and Enmagos, or potentially even Vern. Um, that is something that could very well happen. So I do think we're gonna see some conflict there next session.
And then let's dive right in. Eskin, the
Yeah.
center of action. It was last season. It's appearing to be that way again this season.
Hmm.
Tremendous first war between Marhold, Adenica, and Cyranovar. Obviously, Arboran took advantage of the situation to scoop up some essentially free land from Adenica. Um,
Yeah.
in the end, Cyranovar was able to separate piece out Adenica and then capitalize on Marhold. Round two came shortly after, with Caveria moving in against Cyranovar that had been depleted to a large extent from a manpower perspective in that first war. And it dragged on. It's still going here in the as we enter next session. A whole lot to unpack there.
Yeah.
Besides Arboran, who came out of that previous session looking better than when they went into it?
Probably Corvuria, I'd say, because in that time they've also been able to expand a little bit in Esken proper. Um, so yeah, they've made some territorial gains, and yeah, I'd say the big losers here would be Adenica and Marhold. Marhold could, of course, get some of their territory back, which the Corvuria player does seem intending to do. Uh, but yeah, Marl's taken the brunt of the damage there. So has Sedenica, and now, of course, Serenivar. Though I must say, I'm not sure if this war is going to be over anytime soon. Um, Phoenix Empire is still untouched and has been regaining manpower, and they're throwing their money around quite, through Orlus MSD and other ways as well. I think they've been sending money to Serenifar uh, just in lump sums. I think we could see, if push comes to shove, Phoenix Empire recruiting massive amounts of mercs and letting their money work for them, as a potentially small country considers that, you know what, maybe all this money that I'm sending to Arbran and Kavoria, who are still losing money even with small country subsidies, they're going to say, like, you know what, I don't think this war is worth my money. And we could see drastic shift of balance in this war going forward.
Yeah, it's interesting. Caveria maybe made some small territorial gains. I'm not sure they outweigh the cost that this current war has inflicted upon them. Their war exhaustion is relatively high since a large portion of the early war was fought in their lands directly.
Yeah.
They've taken out a little bit of debt. Their manpower is nearly exhausted, whereas Arbaran's been fighting primarily on mercs and has
Mm-hmm.
access to the Dame's Head trade node, so has not had to dip into debt. It's interesting. Do you think there's an opportunity for Danica and Marhold to use this ongoing war to consolidate the remaining Eskin miners and prepare for a round two, or is the relationship between Marhold and Adenica gone, and Adenica is on an island of Regent Court by itself?
Um, that's going to be difficult to say. I think Marhold could well do a little bit more expanding in the area, though may want to keep their manpower reserves ready to also strike at Ziranafar. That may come with its own risks. Danica has a bit of an AE issue from their rapid expansion. And I think the dev that Identica has reflects that as well, seeing they're quite on par with Kavuria, even though um, they got full occupied twice in those previous wars. Um, so yeah, Identica could probably do some more expansion, but if they don't get outside support, they're in a bit of an issue between three Core Knight powers that might want to gobble them up.
And you mentioned you don't see this war ending anytime soon. As we dive into the numbers, obviously the Wood Elves have a decent amount of debt, but the ability to go quite a bit further into it. Um,
Mm-hmm.
Manpower is tapped, but I believe they're fighting with mainly mercenaries at this point.
Yes.
Phoenix Empire, manpower has been a little bit low throughout. Um, Debt
They
is
started this war with zero, so
yeah, debt's completely fine. It, there's diminishing returns for Phoenix Empire to be tied up in these wars when there's opportunities to consolidate Bulwar, but
mm-hmm.
the wars are fun to fight, and there's not many other opponents for the Phoenix Empire. Do you see them committing to a greater extent than they are now? Looking at their force limit, they only have built about 90 out of 180. Looking at their professionalism, they are tapped there, but they could hire a few additional mercenary companies pretty easily and throw another 50, 75 units into this war. Do you think that's likely to happen?
uh, I do, frankly. Yes, they could do a little bit more consolidation in the area, but other than that, I think they are really tied to the Wood Elves, and they want to see them succeed. And we already see that even though the Phoenix Empire is limited on Diplo slots, they have spread their influence elsewhere, um, with sending subsidies to Orla's MSD and getting the mercs or the Conateri from Thieving Arrow for the Wood Elves, that is. So yeah, I think they're trying to use their diplomatic weight uh, in other ways than just the alliance slots they really don't have, and we'll focus on keeping Zeranifor alive and kicking. So that's just my prediction.
And then leaving Eskin out, as we look at the map as a whole, where else do you see potential um, conflicts brewing?
The New World, for sure. I think the Ruinborn powers in Neckcliff are gearing up for a war against Eberthiel, their colonial nations. Even though in the south they can do a little bit more consolidation, um, but especially if there's got to be religious conflict that Vern undoubtedly will participate in, I wouldn't be surprised if they use that chance to kick them out. Other than that, potentially the Lake Fed versus the Ogres. I'm not sure what their diplomatic situation is, but surely they will have reasons to go after each other.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting. The Lake Fed obviously doesn't have anyone else they could go after outside the
Mm-hmm.
ogres. So unless they wanted to play a role similar to the one that the Phoenix Empire has assumed with Cyranovar, as the ogres look to expand in to maybe Frozen Maw and eventually Bjarnrik or into the dwarves, etc. Um, Lake Fed's hands are kind of tied here.
Yeah. Also, I'm not sure, which is maybe also a thing to consider. Once they unify, what that is going to do for their gov capacity. Seeing that is a rule, so they may well just play friendly for a bit because they may be tied on gov cap, but that's something I'm not sure of.
Yeah, they're. It's gonna be interesting. Um, their idea set may come into play here. They do have a tremendous gov cap right now, but
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure it's enough. Um, they do have the estate edicts as an
Mm-hmm.
option, but yeah, that's going to be something to watch. And we'll start back where or we'll end off where we started. Great
Mm-hmm.
powers of the world, all players right now. Who's not going to be on this list next week? That's currently on it.
It'll highly depend. Uh, I think Servanovar, if they're losing this war, which it looks like right now, uh, they're gonna get kicked out. Other than that, I don't see many shifts.
Yeah, I'm gonna go Saranavar, yes. I'm also gonna go with the Greeks. I think there's a chance they get knocked off this list.
I wouldn't be so sure about it, because they have a lot of vassals, and vassals only count for half. They're integrating one. Um, they still also have colonists, and they have some more expansion opportunities. I think they can remain on this list simply because of their vassals that they can integrate, and a lot more land they still have to colonize.
And then we mentioned obviously Saranavar. We mentioned the Lake Fed, the immediate presence they'll make on the list. Besides
Ah,
Bjarnrik, who else may be moving on to this list?
um, that's difficult. I'm not sure. A small country would also be relatively close, but I'm not sure how much expansion and deving they're going to be able to do, especially considering that indeed the Lake Fed will appear there. So uh, they would have to outgrow Serenivar and potentially even Vern. So that could be a lot of dev for them to get. And I'm not sure if they can get it next session.
Yeah, I'd say maybe Arboran has an outside shot at taking a slot on the list just due to the number of AIs that they're able to gobble up if they um, are able to extract themselves from this war quickly. So they've got Anbenland, the remnants of Gowid, etc. And their aggressive expansion at this point is relatively low. Um, it's a little bit
But
high with a few nations, but compared to their neighbors, You mentioned Adenica's aggressive expansion issues. Rubenair has aggressive expansion issues. Vern's AE is starting to creep up. Bjarnrix is relatively high. So we could see Arbrand, if they extracted themselves, have a feast on the AIs around them.
I still see that as a very distant opportunity because they are like 300 dev away from making it on the list. So I'm not so sure about that. I
Yeah,
mean,
Rubenair
similarly,
wasn't on the list last week, and
I mean
now they're up at number 5.
that's true. Um, yeah, anything can happen. But I'm not sure. Like the land that Arboren could expand into, not all of it is as high dev. Um, there's some, especially in the Damescron area, but especially if you look to Gawet, I wouldn't be surprised if Jarnrik is able to take more opportunity of that before this war is concluded. And Arboran at the moment can't really spare any resources going elsewhere than stay committed to this war. Um,
Yeah, agreed. When we take a look at the overall war participation between the parties and you look at the casualties, obviously the Wood Elves are carrying uh, the majority on their side, and then on the Imperial side, it's Arboran,
mhm.
almost double that of their next closest ally, Cavuria. So um, it's clear who the linchpin of the anti-Elven coalition is.
Yeah, for sure.
Anything else you want to bring up before we wrap up?
Um, I think yeah, no, people are going to be excited to watch Escan. I think things may remain to be interesting in that area. As a Denica's player, I am out for revenge, and that's no secret. Uh, and it's going to be interesting to see what Marhold does in that as well, because uh, yeah, they're reliant on Arboran to and Kavuria to get their cores back. Uh, but on the other side, they are allied to Adenica, and Adenica really wants to get back at Arboran. So yeah,
Well, Arch, best of luck to you next week. I think you're in one of the more interesting spots for all the players around, and thank you for joining us this week.
no problem. Thank you.